Treasures in fragile jars. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 7 through 9, as it was eloquently read by Minister Williams. Throughout history, oppressors have attempted to keep Black people ignorant and degraded. Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 through 13, talk about after Joseph and his brothers died, their descendants applied greatly, and the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. Eventually, a new king came to power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. He said to his people, "Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply and it happen even in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land." Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were in dread of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter and hard bondage in mortar and brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. Does this sound familiar to you? The king ordered 2 Hebrew midwives to monitor the Hebrew women as they gave birth and to kill the babies if they were males. But the midwives feared God and saved the boys. When questioned by the king as to why they did not kill the baby boys, they replied that the Hebrew women were not like the Egyptian women. They were lively and gave birth quickly, too quick for them to get to them. Because they feared God, he gave the midwives families. Hebrew population continued to grow despite the Pharaoh's orders. We now have this light shining in our hearts, but we ourselves are like fragile clay jars containing great treasure. The great treasure is God's power dwelling in us. Can you see how the history keeps repeating itself? Hundreds of years later, Africans, people of color, were sold and or captured in many parts of the world. They were sold into slavery to work from sunup to sundown. In the great America, Blacks were forced to work the white man's fields. They labored by planting cotton, sugarcane, tobacco, and many other cash crops. Many of the men and women were severely beaten as punishment, or simply to break them emotionally, physically, spiritually in front of their wives and children. Can you connect? They were treated worse than cattle and told they were not human, but derived from monkeys or orangutans. Yet, they had 2 eyes, 2 legs, and as much of a brain as the white man, if not more. Blacks have dug gold and enriched this country, yet they continue to mistreat our ancestors, to beat them and murder them. Why? Why did they do that? Just because of the color of their skin? Slave owners took slave women and laid with them, impregnated them, and left them to be further victimized by their rejected and jealous wives. The wives would subject the victims of their husbands to beatings, mistreatment, and even their hatred. Women raped by their slave owners, overseers, and others prayed to God for forgiveness for committing adultery, although they had did nothing wrong. The heinous act sent some men into fits of rages, and as they attempted to protect their women, they were beaten or killed. It also caused dissension between the dark-skinned and lighter-skinned female slaves. Those of lighter complexions were given house duties, and those with darker complexions were placed in the fields. They created racism within our own race. Even today, there is animosity between light and dark-skinned females and males. Darker-skinned females are called unattractive because of their ebony skin. The marvelous thing is that the Black race comes in so many shades that we should embrace one another and rise together like the strong people God made us to be. Television commercials, shows, and movies project Black women with light complexions and dark-skinned men with semi-straight hair as beautiful, and they pair them with Caucasian men. Let me go back over there. Television, commercials, shows, and movies project Black women with light complexions and semi-straight hair as beautiful, and they pair them with Caucasian men. And now we're seeing they're doing the men the same way. They're taking handsome, lighter complexion men, and they're pairing them with Caucasian women. They are sending subliminal messages to our young Black females and males that dark is not beautiful. However, we are treasures in fragile clay jars because God's Holy Spirit resides in us regardless of the color of our skin. Slavery ended in the late 1800s, but during the 1930s, Black men still worked the fields picking cotton and laid tracks for the railroad companies from sunup to sundown. They scrimped and they saved pennies on the dollar to purchase a plot of land and a home for their families, only for it to be taken away after their death, leaving nothing for their children or their grandchildren. Or the banks foreclosed on the home because they couldn't make the payments. Does this sound familiar to you? But they couldn't make the payments because they were constantly being cheated out of their money by the banks. Or because they could not read, they were cheated out of their own property. And for those who could read, who stood their ground, their homes were sometimes burned to the ground, leaving them with nothing. Black men accused of raping and harassing white women were dragged out of their homes in front of their wives and children, beaten, tarred, and feathered, and left to die. What was done? Nothing. Now, our Black men and women are being killed by the police. Where is the justice? When Black families united to become stronger, they were blackballed by local merchants. In other words, they could not make purchases or sell goods to local white businesses, thus putting the Black man out of business. Yet, we survived and migrated from the South to the North, seeking greater opportunities. And in 2020, it is still challenging for Black men to own their own businesses. From the early 1900s to the 30s, the Harlem Renaissance exploded, and African-American culture was manifested in literature, art, music, and dance. W.E.B. Du Bois and others led the great migration of Blacks from the South to the North. But immigration was also on the decline in America, and the northern industries needed workers. So they went south and recruited Blacks to work long, hard hours in dark, sweaty factories for little or nothing. But it was more than they earned in the South. Some middle-class families from the Black Bohemia community in New York moved to Harlem, and white residents fought to keep them from moving in, but they failed. So they moved to other communities. That was called white flight. Does this sound familiar? For about 30 years, Blacks prospered on stage in the arts, but not without discrimination, trials, and tribulations. And they're still struggling to get major roles in movies in 2020. Charles Spurgeon Johnson created the National Urban League magazine to provide resources to create opportunities for Blacks. Did you hear what I said? He created opportunities for Blacks, resources to create opportunities for Blacks. He and others wanted artists such as Langston Hughes to receive credit for their work. Many Black artists created marvelous work, but whites took the credit along with their money. That period in history was an opportunity for Blacks to enter a world dominated by whites. For the first time, Blacks were on the Broadway stage starring in major dramatic roles. Doors of opportunity opened. After the stock market crash of 1929, white patrons stopped purchasing illegal alcohol in Black uptown clubs, and the Harlem Renaissance period quickly began to dismantle. After a riot broke, which destroyed the community, pivotal people and artists moved on to seek other opportunities. Ironic, isn't it, that the same thing took place here in Detroit with Black Bottom. People of color were on the rise. They were uniting and getting stronger. What happens when we unite and we begin to get stronger? What happens? What do they do to us? Black Bottom was a community of Black-owned businesses, social institutions, and nightclubs. The stock market crash and World War II impacted the socioeconomic status of the community, and it rapidly declined. During the 60s, the city conducted an urban renewal program and replaced the community with the Chrysler Freeway and Lafayette Park, a community of mixed income, high-rise apartments, and commercial areas. Many of the residents were relocated to the projects. Ironic, isn't it? The same thing is being done right now in Detroit as I speak. Blacks are being pushed out of the city, and white flight is taking place in the suburbs. As a matter of fact, the projects that remained in the old Black Bottom area were torn down, although there were many Blacks still living in subsidized housing units. Where did they all go? White flight was prominent during the 60s and the 70s in urban and rural communities in New York, Chicago, and Detroit. As whites fled to get away from Blacks, they took away the tax revenue from public school systems, which have been going down ever since. In search of a better life, new job opportunities, and liberation from Jim Crow laws, Blacks found more segregation and discrimination in the North. In Alabama, from 1932 to 1972, 600 poor Black men were subjected to the Tuskegee untreated syphilis experiment in Negro males. The disease lay dormant. It had not manifested in 399 of the men, and 201 of them were free of the disease. Doctors from the U.S. Public Health Service injected placebos or fake treatments to infected patients and watched them either go insane, blind, or suffer from other complications, or they died from the disease. Penicillin was given to treat syphilis in 1942, but the men were denied treatment. 28 men died from the untreated disease. 100 others died from complications. 40 of their spouses were diagnosed with it, and it was passed to 19 children. This so-called experiment lasted for 40 years. How many other people were infected that we don't know about? Although we were no longer slaves, we were still treated as if we were not humans. Now, in 2020, COVID-19 has afflicted many families of every race, culture, and social economic background, but it has been prominent in Black communities across the country. Scientists are now asking for Black people to volunteer to find a vaccine. They want to inject Black people to see if it's a cure for COVID-19. Does this all sound familiar? Black men continue to be accused of raping and harassing white women in the 50s, like Emmett Till, who was dragged from his uncle's house in the middle of the night, forced to carry a 75-pound cotton gin fan down to the riverbanks of the Tallahatchie River, forced to strip off his clothes, severely beaten, eyes gouged out, shot in the head, tied down with barbed wire and the cotton gin fan, and thrown in the river, only for his accusers to be set free. Although we were no longer slaves, we were still treated as if we were not humans. After all that torture, his mother stood strong and fought for justice. Till's death triggered the beginning of the civil rights movement. Once again, Blacks united and rose to fight for their right to life and liberty. We now have this light shining in our hearts, but we ourselves are still like fragile clay jars containing great treasure. This makes it clear that our great power is from God, not from ourselves. We are pressed on every side by troubles, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are hunted down, but never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we are not destroyed. In 2020, Black and brown Americans, especially males, are being shot and killed by police at a disproportionate rate. No, we no longer have Jim Crow laws. We no longer are sharecroppers, and we no longer are slaves, but we are still treated unfairly and oppressed by socioeconomic disparities. Jim Crow laws lingered in restaurants, at diner counters, in the movie theaters, and in concert halls around the country. Young college students united once again to hold sit-ins and freedom rides, to express their voices for justice and liberty. Many were brutally beaten and many killed for standing up for what they believed. Marian Anderson was denied the right to sing at Washington's Constitution Hall because the Daughters of the American Revolution did not like the color of her skin. So she gave a free concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Ironic that they were called the Daughters of the American Revolution. Did they represent the same American Revolution that fought for their independence from the British King? Once again, they march in the streets of Detroit, Chicago, New York, Oregon, and many other states only to be bullied, gassed, pushed, and jailed by the police. This country's leader said the companies that support Black Lives Matter are fools. When does it all end? In 1965, Malcolm X, human rights activist, gunned down. 1968, Martin Luther King Jr., civil rights activist, gunned down. 1991, people watched the video of Rodney King's police beating on television over and over again. 2012, Trayvon Martin, the Black kid in the hoodie, shot to death by a neighborhood watch volunteer. 2014, Eric Gardner's last words were, "I can't breathe," as New York Police Department held him face down on the ground. 2016, the Obamas were depicted in images and called monkeys. Black lives do matter. Hands up. I can't breathe. George Floyd. Elijah McClain, Philando Castine, Michael Brown, Terrence Crutcher, Eric Gardner, Alton Sterling, Breonna Taylor, Oscar Grant. The list goes on and on. There are names that we don't even know. We are like fragile clay jars containing this great treasure, a great power given by God. We are pressed on every side by troubles, by cancer, diabetes, COVID-19, mental illness, drug addiction, high blood pressure, asthma, heart conditions, finances, and depression. We are hunted down, but never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we are not destroyed. God bless you. God bless you. Stand up, people, for what we believe in. God bless you.